early as the 14th century, the Philippines was already on the map in some form. Chinese cartographers during the Yuan dynasty would have depicted the island of Luzon, known to them as Mai, and 3 islands of the Visayas, known to them as Sansu, among the scattering of lands to the southeast of the Chinese coast. Starting from this portrayal, which would have been almost unrecognizable to modern viewers, the iconography of the Philippines developed over the centuries. Advances in geographical and hydrographical knowledge and cartographic accuracy, as well as sweeping changes to the political and societal landscape, led to the country we see today when we look for the Philippines in an atlas or on a map of the world. In order to chart this fascinating journey, author Carlos Quirino set out to create a bibliographic listing of maps showing the Philippines over more than 5 centuries. His assiduous research reveals how a multitude of factions over 5 centuries, Chinese and Japanese traders, Portuguese cartographers, Spanish navigators, Filipino artists, and many more all contributed to building the image and concept of the country we now recognize as our own. Carlos Quirino was the celebrated author of dozens of books and articles on Philippine history and biography, including Quezon, Man of Destiny, Filipinos at War, Old Manila, and a translation of the Boxer Codex. His decades of scholarship, bringing the past to life for Filipino readers, led to him being honored in 1997 as National Artist for Historical Literature. In 1959, Quirino had the first edition of Philippine Cartography printed as a limited run of 100 copies. It was assumed that only a few readers would be interested in such an esoteric topic as maps of the Philippines. But this book, the product of Quirino's 7 years of research, proved to be a valuable reference and much in demand. A second edition was published in Amsterdam in 1963, and a third edition was issued by Vibal Foundation in 2010. Now, with the fourth edition, published by Vibal Foundation and edited by Dr. Carlos Madrid, this landmark work has been updated and enhanced with additional material. Hundreds of images and illustrations and 6 fold-out maps accompany Quirino's text, which has been supplemented with annotations and expanded commentary. In addition, 3 new chapters significantly broaden the author's original lines of inquiry. Over 450 additional maps have been added to form the most extensive bibliography of more than 1,600 Philippine cartographic materials.
Cartographic records, they're not only the representation of the interests of the colonizers, but also represents that negotiation and exchange of knowledge between the inhabitants of the territories, the islanders, the indigenous Filipinos, and the Spanish or Filipino cartographers. In that sense, the exchange of communications, the information that it was provided by indigenous communities upon the request of the colonial officers was what permitted the representation of those territories in the maps made in the Philippines during the colonial times. So we're making use of the maps not only as a representation of the past, but also as a vehicle, as a platform in which that exchange of information was taking place. The colonizers' role was not replacing, or not only replacing indigenous knowledge, or not systematically, but at the same time representing faithfully that territory that the indigenous peoples were inhabiting. Let us remember that I was mentioning a while ago the outstanding work of the Comisión Hidrográfica de Filipinas. It was not only giants like Claudio Montero Ygay, but also the officers that were going with him, with the team, and the Filipino informants and workers and officers as well of the Spanish Navy that were of Philippine origin, that were taking part in the work, and that their contribution was substantial, was indispensable, I will say. The work of these commissions in the 1800s, it has yet to be celebrated, and I feel privileged that we have the opportunity to add this new chapter in the already gigantic work of Carlos Quirino.
In the first chapter, the author examines ancient depictions of the Southeast Asian region through the work of the most prominent figure in the cartography of the ancient world, Claudius Ptolemaeus, better known as Ptolemy, an Egyptian geographer, astronomer, and mathematician who lived in Alexandria around the 2nd century CE. Such was Ptolemy's impact on Western civilization's conception of the world that for almost 1500 years, map makers continued to take his work, along with its inaccuracies, as factual reference. Among the early visitors to the archipelago, it was the Chinese traders who left behind a cartographic record of the islands. In Chapter 2, the author discusses how the earliest map to depict the Philippines was most likely the work of prominent Chinese cartographer Zhu Sheben, also known as Chu Su Pen, in the 13th or early 14th century. This map no longer exists, and our knowledge of it comes from maps made in later centuries that were copied from the older works. The third chapter tells of the first known European to have mentioned one of the islands of the Philippines, Tomé Pires, who was the first Portuguese ambassador to China. The Portuguese surpassed other Europeans of the time in charting coastlines and nautical features. Because these cartographers were less learned, they did not repeat the misconceptions of older works from Ptolemy and Marco Polo. Leading Portuguese cartographers, Pedro and Jorge Reinl, and celebrated Portuguese astronomer Rui Falero were involved in preparing charts for Ferdinand Magellan before his voyage to search for the Spice Islands in 1519. Chapter 4 details the expedition of Magellan as laid out by its chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta. When the survivors of this ill-fated expedition returned to Spain, the cosmographer at the Casa de Contratación in Seville drew a new series of maps with the information they brought. To take advantage of this new cartographic intelligence, as detailed in Chapter 5, the Spanish crown sent several more expeditions to what they initially named the Isles of San Lázaro. These were led by Jofre de Loaiza in 1525, Álvaro de Saavedra in 1527, and Ruy López de Villalobos in 1542. Finally, in 1559, King Philip II, in whose honor the islands had been renamed in 1543, sent a fifth Spanish expedition to consolidate their claim on the Philippines. This was commanded by Miguel López de Legazpi, with his navigator, Augustinian friar Andres de Urdaneta. From then on, as more and more reports made their way back from the islands, European cartographers began including Luzon in their depictions of the archipelago. Chapter 6 focuses on the work of one of the great early Spanish map makers, Alonso de Santa Cruz of Seville. His Islario General de Todas las Islas del Mundo, or General Atlas of all the islands of the world, was presented to the King of Spain in 1545 and contained a lengthy description of several islands of the Philippine archipelago. Chapter 7 discusses the early relations between Japan and the islands of the Philippines. Before the Tokugawa shogunate closed Japan off from the outside world in the 17th century, Japanese trading ships, or shuansen, were actively trading in the South Seas for over 100 years. Some of the portolan maps used by these traders have been preserved to this day and depict Luzon and Mindanao along with other islands. The 8th chapter is new to this edition, telling the story of an obscure map of Chinese origin that was discovered in 2008. Named after British lawyer John Selden, who originally donated it to the library, the so-called Selden map is unusual among other maps from the later Ming Dynasty era, in that it places China off to the side. The center of the map is taken up by the seas and lands surrounding China's southern coast, including the Philippines. This chapter discusses the possible origins and theories regarding this cartographic work. Chapter 9 centers on the earliest maps to focus on the Philippine Islands as their main subject, such as the one made by Peter van den Kier and published in a Dutch pocket atlas at the end of the 16th century. In particular, this chapter contains a reproduction of the Topografía de la Ciudad de Manila by the pilot and cartographer Antonio Fernandez de Rojas. This outstandingly detailed map is the most exact representation we have of the city of Manila prior to the 20th century. Chapter 10 goes into the details of one of the most famous classical maps of the Philippines, the Carta Hydrográfica y Cartográfica de las Islas Filipinas of Jesuit father Pedro Murillo Velarde, published in 1734. This remarkably complete map and sea chart includes sailing routes and names of coastal towns as well as interior topography. Along its sides, illustrated panels depicting native life and customs as well as flora and fauna were the work of a Filipino artist who signed his name as Francisco Suarez, Indio Tagalo. The map's engraver was also a self-described Indio Tagalo, the prolific Nicolas de la Cruz Bagay. As a printer and engraver, de la Cruz Bagay produced numerous works for the Jesuits in the country. Chapter 11, new to this edition of the book, discusses how he engraved the Aspecto Geográfico del Mundo Hispánico, the first world map made by a Filipino cartographer. This geographic work was one of two maps accompanying the 1761 doctoral thesis of Father Vicente de Memije. Another eminent Filipino engraver, Lorenzo Atlas, executed the other map, the Aspecto Simbólico del Mundo Hispánico. This allegorical work depicted Hispania in the image of the Immaculate Conception, with Spain as her head and supported by the Philippines beneath her feet. With the key involvement of Filipino artists, this side-by-side juxtaposition of the geographic and symbolic aspects advanced a unique view of the Spanish Empire and emphasized the crucial role of the Philippines as Spain's gateway to Asia. Chapter 12 covers the efforts of Spanish authorities to chart the waters of the archipelago towards the end of the 18th century. Under the Comisión Hidrográfica Española, Alessandro Malaspina completed a preliminary study for a hydrographic map of the Philippines in 1793. Decades later, Malaspina's work formed the basis for the Carta General del Archipiélago de Filipinas, published in 1826. This chart represented the new standards and conceptions in cartography that prevailed at the start of the 19th century as Spain strove against the rival maritime power of the British. Another new chapter turns the spotlight on the extensive and seldom acknowledged work of the Comisión Hidrográfica de Filipinas during the final century of Spanish rule. The Comisión's charting of Philippine waters, under the leadership of the experienced cartographer and navyman Claudio Montero Igay, was instrumental for safe navigation between the islands and consequently for the sustained economic development of the country. with a list of the various historical names used for the islands in the archipelago in maps, charts, and chronicles over the centuries. Chapter 14 gives special attention to an important aspect of the Philippines as a geographical and ideological construct. Often, the same place would have multiple names attached to it. Names used by native inhabitants. Names used by visitors and traders in their charts. And names imposed by foreign powers in order to lay claim to the land. The name Filipina or Filipina was variously applied to the islands of Mindoro, Samar, and Leyte before it came to denote the entire archipelago as Las Islas Filipinas. The final chapter is the chronological listing of hundreds of charts, maps, plans, and views of the Philippines, showing the progression of cartographic representations of the country from the early 1300s to the beginning of the 20th century. This list comprises the bulk of Carlos Quirino's research, compiled from a broad range of sources, including the U.S. Library of Congress, the Air Collection of Chicago's Newberry Library, the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, the Biblioteca Nacional and Museo Naval in Madrid, and the map collection of Trinidad H. Pardo de Tavera.
Cartography in general and Philippine cartography in particular is more important than ever. We have seen in recent years how political litigations, international litigation related to the sovereignty of the Spratly Islands or the so-called South China Sea has brought into light the importance and the relevance of maps as reflections of political views of the times, of the 1600s, the 1700s, and the 1800s. Either the map of the Treaty of Paris in 1898 or the Murillo Velarde map of the 1700s have been used and continue to be of outstanding relevance for contemporary purposes. In that sense, we cannot do more than thank those who have preceded us in appreciating and understanding not only this importance that we now make use of, but not only that importance, but also the appreciation of those artifacts and the appreciation of those documents that reflect a time, a place, and the work of those who made it.
Over centuries of history, the form of the Philippines has been shaped and defined, often by outside parties and powers with their own agenda. The people of these islands gradually evolved in the way they conceived of themselves, forming a national identity and asserting their right to govern this nation. Today, when the countries of the world can be seen from the air and even from space, the lines drawn on centuries-old maps continue to be of urgent relevance, and the Philippines must continue to define its borders and assert its sovereignty. Like the old maps, Carlos Quirino's work continues to enlighten us and unfold our understanding of our place in the world as Filipinos.